My name is Ethan, and I've spent my whole life watching my brother get away with things he didn't deserve. But I never thought he'd go this far. He stood in front of our family, smiling like he had just won the lottery. And in a way, he had. Before he passed, Grandpa gave me this letter, Ryan announced, holding up an envelope. He wanted me to have his lake house. The room erupted in applause. My parents beamed. My stomach dropped. Because I knew one thing for sure, that letter was a lie. And this time, I wasn't going to let him take what wasn't his. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, my mind was racing. The lake house. Grandpa's most treasured place. The only place that had ever truly felt like home to me. I glanced around the room. My parents were smiling, Ryan's fiancée clapped, and a few of our relatives murmured congratulations. No one questioned it. No one even hesitated to believe him. Except for Jamie. She caught my eye from across the room, brows furrowed, her expression mirroring exactly what I was feeling. This didn't make sense. Ryan barely visited the lake house. In the past 5 years, he had been there maybe twice, and both times he complained about how boring it was. No Wi-Fi, no bars, nothing to do. Meanwhile, I had spent nearly every weekend there with Grandpa. Fixing up the dock, repainting the shutters, listening to his stories by the fire. And 3 weeks ago, Grandpa had pulled me aside, his hands trembling from age, and handed me something, a small wooden box. Don't open this, he had said, his voice weak but steady. Not until you need to know the truth. I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. But now as Ryan stood there, basking in the attention, I did. I needed to leave. I had to see what was inside that box. I stood abruptly. Jamie raised an eyebrow, but I just gave her a quick nod before slipping away from the party. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside. My car was parked down the street, and I wasted no time getting in and driving home. My hands were tight on the wheel, my heart pounding. What if I was wrong? What if Grandpa had changed his mind? But deep down, I knew better. Grandpa wasn't the kind of man to make last-minute decisions like that. He was careful, thoughtful. If he had wanted Ryan to have the house, he would have told me. When I got home, I went straight to my bedroom and pulled the wooden box from the top shelf of my closet. The aged cedar felt smooth under my fingers, and for a second I hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, I lifted the lid. Inside, there were several neatly folded documents, a sealed envelope with my name on it, and a small brass key. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the top document. My breath caught in my throat. A notarized deed, transferring full ownership of the lake house to me. It had been signed and finalized 6 months ago. I grabbed the envelope and tore it open. Grandpa's familiar handwriting filled the page, shaky but unmistakable. My dear Ethan, it began. By the time you read this, I will likely be gone. I need you to know that the lake house belongs to you. It always has. You were the only one who ever truly loved it. I had everything notarized and filed properly, so there should be no disputes. But I know your brother. I know he might try to claim something that was never his. If that happens, show them the truth. Stand your ground. This house was meant for you. I exhaled shakily. Ryan had lied. He had faked that letter. And he had no idea that the real proof was sitting right here in my hands. My phone buzzed, a message from Jamie. You okay? That was weird. I quickly typed back. Need to check something at home. Cover for me. A few seconds later, she responded. Got it. But hurry. Something feels off. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed the documents, tucked them back into the wooden box, and headed for the door. Because I wasn't going to let Ryan get away with this. Not this time. The drive back to Ryan's house felt surreal. The streetlights blurred past as my mind replayed the last hour over and over. Ryan lied. He stood in front of our entire family and fabricated a story to steal something that was never his. But the worst part? They all believed him. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Not for long. Before I continue this story, I want to connect with you, my incredible viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. Let's see how many places the story reaches. I pulled up a block away from Ryan's house. The party was still going, though the crowd had thinned. I could see people chatting inside through the big living room windows. No one suspected a thing. I took a deep breath and glanced at the wooden box on the passenger seat. Inside this box was the truth, and I was about to set the record straight. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, my heartbeat steady but determined. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I wasn't here to yell or throw accusations. Grandpa always told me the truth doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be undeniable. I knocked once. The door swung open almost immediately. Ryan stood there, drink in hand, his face twisting into something between surprise and annoyance. Work emergency over already? He asked, his voice dripping with fake concern. We need to talk. My voice was calm but firm. I stepped past him into the house. The conversation around the room died down as people noticed me. My mother turned from the couch, her eyes lighting up. Ethan, we were just talking about the cabin. Isn't it wonderful news about Ryan? Jamie caught my eye from across the room. She sat stiffly in the corner, arms crossed, watching the situation unfold. Actually, I said, setting the wooden box down on the coffee table, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Ryan's expression faltered for just a second before he quickly masked it with a smug smile. He knew. He knew something was coming. What's in the box? He asked, his voice too casual. I met his gaze. Something Grandpa gave me 3 weeks ago. My father leaned forward with interest. What is it, son? I flipped open the lid, pulling out the notarized deed and Grandpa's letter. My hands were steady as I laid them on the table for everyone to see. 6 months ago, Grandpa legally transferred ownership of the lake house to me, I said evenly. It's not part of his estate. It was never up for debate. It was already mine. The room fell completely silent. My mother's eyes flickered to Ryan in confusion. My father picked up the document, scanning the signature carefully. Ryan stood frozen. His face drained of color. This has to be a mistake, he stammered. Grandpa gave me a letter. I cut in. Right? The one you showed everyone tonight. May I see it? My father hesitated before handing me Ryan's letter. The moment I placed it next to Grandpa's real handwriting, the difference was undeniable. The original letter shaky, uneven, the natural tremor of an aging man's hand. Ryan's letter too perfect. Too smooth. Too deliberate. Jamie leaned forward, staring at the two side by side. Oh my God, she whispered. My mother let out a quiet gasp. Ryan, my father's voice was barely above a whisper, did you forge this? Ryan's silence was answer enough. The air felt thick, the weight of what he had done sinking into the room like a slow building storm. Then, just as I expected, he snapped. You don't get it. His voice was sharp, defensive. It's not fair that you get everything, Ethan. You were always Grandpa's favorite. You got to spend all the time with him. You got the special bond. I got nothing. I blinked, caught off guard. Was that what this was about? Ryan, my mother said slowly, shaking her head, this isn't about favorites. You tried to steal something that wasn't yours. I didn't steal anything, he shot back. I just wanted something of his. Something that mattered. The anger in his voice cracked at the edges, giving way to something else. Something raw. I exhaled. This was bigger than the lake house. This was years of resentment. Years of feeling like he was left out, like he didn't belong in the same way I did. But it didn't justify what he did. I reached back into the wooden box and pulled out something I hadn't mentioned yet, a second sealed envelope. This one had Ryan's name on it, written in Grandpa's familiar script. Ryan frowned. What is that? I held it out to him. Something Grandpa left for you. For the first time that night, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he took the envelope and opened it. His eyes scanned the letter. His breathing hitched. His face went pale. What does it say, son? My father asked gently. Ryan swallowed hard. Then, in a quiet, almost broken voice, he read aloud. Ryan, if you're reading this, it means you tried to take the lake house. And if that's the case, I want you to understand something. What you need isn't a house. It's purpose. It's something that belongs to you, something you build for yourself. Ryan's voice faltered. He cleared his throat and continued. I left you something. Enclosed with this letter is a check for $25,000. Not as an inheritance, but as an opportunity. Use it to start something meaningful. Something that makes you come alive. The lake house was never your dream, Ryan. But your future? That's still yours to build. A stunned silence followed. Ryan slowly reached into the envelope and pulled out the check. He stared at it like it was something foreign, something he didn't quite know how to hold. He knew, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. He knew I'd do this. Jamie let out a breath. Grandpa was 3 steps ahead of you, huh? Ryan's grip tightened on the check. His jaw clenched. He looked around the room, at her parents, at me, at the undeniable proof of what he had done. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out the door. No one stopped him. The weight of the moment lingered in the air long after he was gone. My mother pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes glassy with disappointment. My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temple. Jamie leaned back, exhaling sharply. Well, she said, voice dry, that went well. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hands were still gripping the wooden box like it was the only thing grounding me. Ryan had lost the lake house. But he had gained something else. Whether he'd actually use it, that was a story for another day. The house felt eerily silent after Ryan left. The weight of his actions still hung in the air, thick with disbelief and unspoken words. My mother sank onto the couch, pressing her fingers against her temples. My father let out a slow breath, his gaze locked on the forged letter still sitting on the table. Jamie broke the silence first. Well, that was a disaster. I didn't answer. My hands were still resting on the wooden box, as if I needed to feel its solidity to ground myself. I had come here prepared for a confrontation, but I hadn't expected this, a confession laced with years of resentment, a parting gift from Grandpa that hit harder than any argument could. My mother finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Why would he do this? My father shook his head. Because he was afraid he'd been left out. His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. Jamie scoffed. And he thought forging a letter and stealing a house was the solution? I glanced at the door, half expecting Ryan to storm back in. But he didn't. He was gone. Maybe for the night. Maybe for longer. I wasn't sure. He wanted something of Grandpa's, I said finally. Something that made him feel connected. My mother sighed, wiping at her eyes. And Grandpa knew, she murmured. He always knew. I nodded. He had seen right through Ryan's insecurities and had tried, in his own way, to guide him towards something better. The check wasn't just money, it was a chance. A way out of his jealousy if he chose to take it. The problem was I wasn't sure Ryan would. Jamie leaned forward, studying me carefully. So, what now? Are you going to the lake house? I hesitated for only a second before answering. Yeah. First thing in the morning. Jamie nodded as if she had expected that answer. My mother's brows creased. Alone? I just need to be there, I admitted. I need to see it. To make sure everything is the way Grandpa left it. My father's expression softened. That place meant everything to him, son. Take care of it. I intended to. The conversation died down after that. My parents, still emotionally drained, retreated upstairs. Jamie lingered for a while but eventually called it a night, squeezing my shoulder before heading out. As I drove home, my mind was still spinning. The evening had unraveled years of hidden resentment, exposed wounds I hadn't even known existed. But more than anything, it had confirmed what I had always suspected: Ryan never really wanted the house. He wanted what it symbolized. But symbols weren't inherited. They were built. And the only thing Ryan had ever built was a wall between us. I barely slept that night. When the first traces of morning light filtered through my window, I was already up, already moving. By the time I pulled out of my driveway, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over the road stretching ahead. The drive to the lake house was familiar, every turn embedded in muscle memory. I had made this trip countless times before, but today everything felt different. Heavier. As if the weight of responsibility had finally settled fully onto my shoulders. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the house stood exactly as I remembered it. Weathered cedar siding, deep green shutters, the wraparound porch where Grandpa used to sit and sip his coffee in the mornings. For a long moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, taking it all in. This was mine now. Not just a house. Not just property. A legacy. Stepping out of the car, I made my way up the wooden steps. The porch creaked beneath my weight, just like it always had. I pulled the brass key from my pocket, the one Grandpa had left in the wooden box, and slid it into the lock. The door resisted for just a second before clicking open. The scent of aged wood and faint traces of pipe tobacco greeted me. Everything was exactly as Grandpa had left it. His books stacked neatly on the side table. His old fishing rod propped against the corner. The plaid blanket he always kept draped over his armchair. I let out a slow breath. It still felt like he was here. Moving through the house, I let my fingers trail over familiar surfaces, memories washing over me with each step. The laughter shared over late-night card games. The mornings spent fishing off the dock. The quiet evenings listening to him tell stories about his youth, his voice steady and warm. I ended up in his study. The antique roll-top desk stood against the far wall, bathed in the morning light filtering through the window. I knew what was inside before I even opened it. Sliding the key into the lock, I rolled back the cover. Stacks of neatly organized folders filled the compartments, each one labeled in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. One for me. One for Ryan. One for Jamie. One for every member of the family. I pulled mine out first. Inside were photographs, old birthday cards, newspaper clippings, small pieces of my life that Grandpa had collected over the years. He had done the same for Ryan. I ran my fingers over the label on my brother's folder before pulling it out. It was filled with the same things: pictures from his childhood, newspaper articles from his high school debate championships, even a printed announcement of his first promotion. I stared at it for a long moment. Ryan had spent years convinced that Grandpa had favored me, that he had been left out, ignored. He had no idea that Grandpa had been proud of him all along. I wasn't sure what to do with that realization. Not yet. Instead, I closed the folder and set it aside, making a silent decision to hold onto it. Maybe someday Ryan would be ready to see it. For now, I had a house to take care of. Stepping back outside, I inhaled deeply. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, crisp and familiar. The lake stretched out in front of me, shimmering under the morning sun. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to Jamie's number. Made it to the lake house, I texted. A few seconds later, she responded. How does it feel? I looked around. The house. The water. The trees rustling in the breeze. The ghosts of 1,000 memories woven into every piece of this place. Like home. I spent the rest of the day walking through the house, reacquainting myself with every inch of it. Even though I had spent years here, it felt different now, heavier, like the house itself understood the shift. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I was sitting on the porch with a cold beer, staring out over the lake. The water was still, reflecting the deep oranges and purples of the evening sky. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice beside me, telling me how the lake always looked the best at sunset. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs. For the first time since he passed, I didn't feel like he was gone. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Ryan. I hesitated before picking up. Hey! There was silence for a moment. Then, finally, are you at the cabin? Yeah. Another pause. Then a sigh. Can I come by? I didn't answer right away. A part of me wanted to say no, to tell him he had no right to set foot on this property after what he did. But another part of me, I wasn't sure. Yeah, I said finally. Come by in the morning. Ryan didn't respond at first. Then, a quiet, okay. The call ended. I exhaled, setting my phone aside. I wasn't sure why I had agreed. Maybe because deep down, I knew this place was meant to bring family together, not tear it apart. Maybe because Grandpa would have wanted it that way. The next morning, I was already up when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I stayed on the porch, watching as Ryan stepped out. He looked different. The usual arrogance in his posture was gone. He seemed smaller, like he had been carrying something heavy, and for once, he wasn't trying to pretend otherwise. He climbed the porch steps hesitantly. I wasn't sure if you'd actually let me come, he admitted. Neither was I. A small, humorless chuckle. Then silence. I studied him for a moment. He looked exhausted, like the weight of the past few days had finally caught up to him. You want a beer? I asked. Ryan blinked. He clearly hadn't expected that. Yeah, sure. I disappeared inside, grabbed 2 bottles, and handed him one as I sat back down. He took it, twisting the cap off but not drinking right away. I used the money, he said after a while, staring out at the lake. I glanced at him. The check. He nodded. Signed up for that business course I kept talking about. Figured if Grandpa believed I could build something, I should at least try. I didn't say anything right away. Then, finally, good. Ryan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I was wrong, about the house, about everything. I waited. I thought if I had it, it would mean something, that maybe it would prove I was just as important to him as you were. But, he gestured vaguely toward the lake, toward the cabin. This was never really mine, was it? I shook my head. No, but that doesn't mean he didn't love you. Ryan swallowed hard, staring down at the porch floor. I reached beside me, grabbing the folder I had set aside yesterday, and handed it to him. What's this? He asked warily. Open it. He hesitated before flipping it open. His eyes scanned the contents. Photos, clippings, little pieces of his life that Grandpa had saved. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his fingers tightening on the edges of the paper. He kept all of this? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I said quietly. He was proud of you, Ryan. He just showed it in his own way. Ryan nodded slowly, running his thumb over a faded picture of him and Grandpa standing by the grill one summer. We sat there for a long time, the silence stretching between us. But for the first time in years, it wasn't filled with resentment. It just was. So what happens now? Ryan finally asked, looking up at me. I considered that for a moment. Then, I gestured toward the cabin. I could use some help fixing the dock. You in? Ryan studied me for a second before nodding. Yeah, I'm in. And just like that, the door was open. Not completely, not fully, but enough. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this story? Drop a 2 in the comments if you loved it, or a 7 if it wasn't for you. Let's see where everyone stands. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps more people find these stories. And hey, if you enjoy stories that make you think, that stir emotions, and that always come with a twist, make sure you're subscribed to Mr.HeartVibes. There's so much more coming your way, and I can't wait to share it with you. See you in the next story.